Picture this. You're walking through the marble corridors of Topkapi Palace in 1789, your footsteps echoing against walls that have witnessed centuries of imperial power. The air is thick with incense and fear as you follow a eunuch guard deeper into the palace complex, past chambers where sultans once held court over an empire spanning 3 continents. But you're not heading to the throne room or the famous imperial harem, where the sultan's wives and concubines lived in luxury. No, you're being led somewhere far more sinister, to chambers that most historians refuse to acknowledge existed. The guard stops before an innocuous wooden door, no different from dozens of others you've passed. But when it creaks open, the smell hits you first. A mixture of perfumed oils, human sweat, and something else you can't quite identify but that makes your stomach turn. Your eyes adjust to the dim light, and you see them. Dozens of young men, some barely past adolescence, chained to walls in poses that would make classical sculptors weep. Their beauty is undeniable, but their eyes hold a terror that no amount of silk clothing or golden ornaments can disguise. Welcome to the secret world of Sultan Abdul Hamid I's male harem, a twisted institution that existed in the shadows of Ottoman power for over 2 decades. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of imperial excess. It's the story of how absolute power, when combined with sexual obsession and paranoid cruelty, can create a hell on earth disguised as paradise. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The man who would become history's most twisted sultan wasn't born a monster. Abdul Hamid entered the world in 1725 as just another Ottoman prince, the son of Sultan Ahmed III, destined for a life of luxury but never expected to rule. In the Byzantine complexity of Ottoman succession, he was far down the line of potential heirs, which should have meant a comfortable but unremarkable existence in the palace's golden cage. But fate has a way of elevating the wrong people to ultimate power. When Abdul Hamid finally ascended to the throne in 1774 at the age of 49, he had spent decades watching, waiting, and developing appetites that would have horrified even his predecessors. The Ottoman court had always been a place of sexual intrigue and exotic pleasures, but Abdul Hamid brought something new to the throne: a systematic approach to cruelty that turned desire into torture and pleasure into punishment. The traditional Ottoman harem system was already controversial enough. Hundreds of women, captured or purchased from across the empire, lived in gilded captivity to serve the sultan's desires and produce potential heirs. But Abdul Hamid looked at this centuries-old institution and saw an opportunity for innovation. Why limit himself to women when the empire's vast territories could provide him with an entirely different kind of collection? The idea began innocently enough. If anything about imperial sexual slavery can be called innocent. During his early years as Sultan, Abdul Hamid noticed a young page in his service, a boy of perhaps 16 with the kind of ethereal beauty that seemed to glow from within. The boy's name was Mehmet, and he had been taken from a Christian family in the Balkans as part of the Devshirme system that supplied the Ottoman military and bureaucracy with fresh talent. But Abdul Hamid wasn't interested in Mehmet's administrative potential. Night after night, the Sultan found himself watching the young man as he performed his duties, noting the graceful way he moved, the delicate features that seemed almost feminine in their perfection. What started as admiration quickly became obsession, and obsession in the hands of absolute power becomes something far more dangerous. The first sign that something had gone wrong in the Sultan's mind came when he ordered Mehmet to be moved from the general servants' quarters to special chambers near his own private apartments. The boy was given fine clothes, jewelry, and his own retinue of servants. To outside observers, it might have looked like a promotion, a young man being elevated by imperial favor. But those who knew the Sultan understood that Mehmet had become something else entirely. The first acquisition in what would become a collection of human treasures. Abdul Hamid's treatment of Mehmet established the template for everything that would follow. The boy was no longer allowed to leave the palace complex or communicate with anyone outside the Sultan's inner circle. His days were structured around the Sultan's desires, his meals planned to maintain his physical beauty, his exercise regimen designed to preserve the lean strength that had first caught the imperial eye. But it was the nights that revealed the true nature of Abdul Hamid's obsession. The Sultan would summon Mehmet to his private chambers for what he called philosophical discussions, lengthy conversations that began with questions about the nature of beauty and ended with demands that grew increasingly intimate and disturbing. Mehmet, trapped by his status as imperial property, had no choice but to comply with whatever the Sultan requested. The psychological torture of this arrangement was perhaps worse than any physical abuse. Mehmet was constantly reminded that his comfort, his safety, even his life depended entirely on the Sultan's continued favor. One wrong word, one moment of resistance, one sign that his beauty was fading, and he could be discarded as easily as he had been elevated. The golden chains that bound him to the palace were no less real for being invisible. Word of the Sultan's new favorite inevitably spread through the palace's network of spies and gossips. Some viewed it as merely another example of imperial eccentricity, no different from previous sultans' obsessions with particular concubines or artistic pursuits. But others recognized something more disturbing in Abdul Hamid's behavior, a systematic approach to possession that suggested this was only the beginning. They were right to be concerned. Within months of Mehmet's elevation, the Sultan's agents were quietly scouring the empire for young men who fit his specific criteria. The search wasn't random or casual, it was conducted with the precision of a military campaign, complete with detailed reports and careful selection processes. The ideal candidates were between 15 and 20 years old, possessed of exceptional physical beauty that combined strength with delicacy. They needed to be intelligent enough to engage the Sultan in conversation, but not so worldly as to resist his authority. Most importantly, they had to be completely isolated from any support network that might challenge their captivity. Christians from the Balkans were particularly prized, partly for their often striking physical features and partly because their families' lower status in the Ottoman hierarchy made resistance impossible. Jewish boys from Salonika and Smyrna brought intellectual sophistication that the Sultan found stimulating. Young men from the Caucasus offered exotic beauty that seemed almost otherworldly to Ottoman sensibilities. But Abdul Hamid's collection wasn't limited by geography or religion. Agents operating throughout the empire identified potential acquisitions wherever they could be found, using a combination of purchase, coercion, and outright kidnapping to assemble what the Sultan privately called his Garden of Delights. The process of acquisition was itself a form of torture, designed to break the spirits of new arrivals before they even reached the palace. Young men were torn from their families in the middle of the night, chained in carts for journeys that could last weeks, and subjected to constant reminders that their previous lives had ended forever. By the time they arrived at Topkapi Palace, most were already psychologically prepared for whatever fate awaited them. The palace complex where they found themselves was a maze of courtyards, gardens, and chambers that could easily house thousands of residents. But Abdul Hamid's male acquisitions weren't housed in the general servants' quarters, or even in accommodations similar to the traditional harem. Instead, the Sultan ordered the construction of special chambers designed specifically for his growing collection. These rooms, carved out of existing palace structures and connected by hidden passages, represented a masterpiece of perverted architecture. Each chamber was designed to be both luxurious and confining, beautiful and terrifying. The walls were covered in the finest silk and decorated with precious stones, but the windows were barred and the doors could only be opened from the outside. The furniture in each room was carefully selected to serve the Sultan's purposes. Divans and cushions provided comfort but were positioned to display their occupants to best advantage. Mirrors were placed at strategic angles to multiply the visual impact of beauty. Chains and restraints, crafted by the palace's finest metalworkers, were incorporated into the decor so seamlessly that visitors might mistake them for decorative elements. Most disturbing of all were the viewing chambers, hidden spaces from which the Sultan could observe his collection without being seen. These architectural innovations allowed Abdul Hamid to indulge his voyeuristic tendencies while maintaining the illusion of privacy for his captives. The young men never knew when they were being watched, creating a state of constant performance anxiety that added another layer to their psychological torment. The daily routine imposed on the male harem members was designed to maintain their physical beauty while breaking down their psychological resistance. They were awakened before dawn for ritual bathing, in water scented with rare oils and perfumes. Their bodies were massaged by skilled attendants who had been trained to identify any flaw or imperfection that might displease the Sultan. Meals were carefully planned by palace nutritionists to maintain optimal physical condition. The portions were precisely calculated to prevent both weight gain and loss, while the ingredients were selected for their supposed effects on skin tone, hair quality, and general vitality. Eating became another form of control, with every bite monitored and regulated according to the Sultan's aesthetic preferences. Physical exercise was mandatory but carefully controlled. The young men were required to maintain their strength and flexibility through dance-like movements that emphasized grace over power. These sessions, conducted under the watchful eyes of eunuch supervisors, served multiple purposes: maintaining physical condition, providing entertainment for the Sultan when he chose to observe, and reinforcing the message that their bodies belonged entirely to imperial pleasure. Education continued as well, but it focused on subjects that would make them more entertaining companions for the Sultan. They studied poetry, music, and philosophy, but always with the understanding that their knowledge existed only to please their captor. Languages were taught so they could converse on sophisticated topics, but foreign correspondence was forbidden. Art appreciation was encouraged, but only in service of understanding their role as living artworks in the Sultan's collection. The psychological manipulation embedded in this routine was breathtakingly sophisticated. By surrounding the young men with luxury while simultaneously restricting their freedom, Abdul Hamid created a state of cognitive dissonance that made resistance seem almost ungrateful. They were fed the finest foods while being starved of human connection. They were educated in the highest arts while being denied the most basic human dignity. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of their captivity was the way it pit them against each other. The Sultan made it clear that his favor was limited and must be earned through competition. Those who pleased him most received better accommodations, finer clothing, and more freedom within their golden cage. Those who disappointed him faced punishments that served as lessons for the others. This system of rewards and punishments created a hierarchy within the male harem that mirrored the broader palace structure. Senior members, those who had survived longest and learned to navigate the Sultan's moods most successfully, wielded considerable influence over newcomers. They could make the difference between a bearable existence and a living hell, but only by maintaining their own precarious positions in the Sultan's affections. The corruption of human relationships under these conditions was perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire system. Young men who might have formed genuine friendships or found mutual support instead learned to view each other as competitors for a master's favor. Trust became dangerous. Kindness was seen as weakness, and survival required the abandonment of basic human empathy. As word of Abdul Hamid's innovations spread through the Ottoman elite, reactions were mixed but telling. Some courtiers expressed private admiration for the Sultan's creativity and sophistication, viewing the male harem as an artistic achievement worthy of imperial grandeur. Others worried about the theological implications of such obvious deviation from traditional Islamic practices. But criticism, when it came, focused more on practical concerns than moral ones. The expense of maintaining such an elaborate system was enormous, draining resources that might have been used for military campaigns or public works. The security requirements were equally demanding, as the existence of the male harem had to be kept secret from foreign diplomats and domestic critics alike. Most importantly, the time and energy Abdul Hamid devoted to his collection was time Wahid taken away from governing an empire that faced increasing challenges from European powers and internal rebellions. While the Sultan indulged his fantasies behind palace walls, the Ottoman Empire was slowly crumbling under pressures that required focused leadership and strategic thinking. But Abdul Hamid seemed oblivious to these larger concerns, consumed by the immediate pleasures of his expanding collection. Each new acquisition brought fresh excitement, new possibilities for experimentation, and renewed satisfaction in his power to transform free human beings into living ornaments for his private enjoyment. The young men who populated his chambers had become more than captives. They were proof of his ultimate authority over life, death, and everything in between. The transformation of these young men from free individuals into living dolls for the Sultan's amusement didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process of psychological demolition that Abdul Hamid had perfected through years of experimentation. The Sultan understood that breaking a person's spirit required more than physical restraint. It demanded the systematic destruction of everything that made them human. The process began the moment a new acquisition arrived at the palace. After the initial shock of capture and transport, the young men were brought to what Abdul Hamid called the preparation chambers, rooms designed to strip away their former identities like layers of old paint. Their clothes were burned in front of them, eliminating any physical connection to their previous lives. Their hair was cut and styled according to the Sultan's preferences, often in ways that emphasized their youth and vulnerability. But the most devastating part of this initial transformation was the renaming ceremony. Each young man was assigned a new identity, usually something that reflected Abdul Hamid's perception of their most appealing qualities. A boy with particularly expressive eyes might become Gozlu, the beautiful-eyed one. Another with graceful movements could be renamed Rax, the dancer. These weren't just new names, they were complete erasures of personal history, reducing complex human beings to their most superficial attributes. The psychological impact of losing one's name cannot be overstated. Names carry our sense of self, our family connections, our place in the world. When Abdul Hamid stripped these young men of their birth names, he was performing a kind of murder, killing who they had been to make room for who he wanted them to become. The boys would lie awake in their silk-covered cells, repeating their real names like prayers, terrified that if they forgot them completely, they would disappear entirely. The Sultan's daily routine with his collection followed patterns that would have seemed almost domestic if they weren't so profoundly disturbing. Each morning he would conduct what he called his garden walk, moving through the chambers to inspect his human flowers. The young men were required to pose in specific ways as he passed, displaying themselves like artwork in a gallery. Those who pleased him with their appearance or demeanor might receive a touch, a whispered compliment, or a small gift. Those who disappointed him faced consequences that served as lessons for everyone else. The punishments Abdul Hamid devised were designed to be psychologically devastating, while leaving no permanent physical marks that might mar his collection's beauty. A young man who showed insufficient enthusiasm might be forced to watch while his favorite possession, perhaps a book or a musical instrument, was destroyed. Another who dared to express homesickness might be made to write letters to his family, describing how happy he was in the palace, knowing these letters would never be sent but forced to participate in the cruel fiction nonetheless. The most feared punishment was temporary exile to what the Sultan called the reflection chamber, a room lined entirely with mirrors where disobedient young men were left alone for days with nothing but their own image for company. The psychological impact of this isolation, combined with the distorted sense of self that came from seeing endless reflections, often broke the strongest spirits. Those who emerged from the reflection chamber were usually model prisoners, having learned that resistance brought only madness. But Abdul Hamid's cruelty wasn't random or purely sadistic. It was calculated to create specific psychological states that he found arousing. He discovered that fear heightened beauty, that desperation made his captives more attentive to his needs, and that hopelessness created a kind of tragic elegance that he found irresistible. The Sultan had turned human suffering into an art form, and he was its most devoted practitioner. The physical layout of the male harem chambers revealed the depth of Abdul Hamid's obsession with control and observation. Hidden passages allowed him to move between rooms without being seen, studying his collection like a scientist observing specimens. Some chambers were connected by speaking tubes that let him eavesdrop on private conversations, gathering intelligence about his captives' mental states and using their whispered fears against them. The furniture in each room served multiple purposes, often in ways that weren't immediately obvious. What appeared to be decorative pillows contained hidden restraints. Beautiful tapestries concealed viewing slots where the Sultan could watch undetected. Even the artwork on the walls served his voyeuristic needs, with mirrors positioned to reflect the most intimate moments and paintings that seemed to watch the room's occupants with painted eyes. The young men quickly learned that privacy was an illusion in their gilded prison. They developed a form of communication based on subtle gestures and meaningful glances, understanding that direct conversation might be overheard and used against them. This constant surveillance created a paranoid atmosphere where trust became impossible, and every interaction carried the potential for betrayal. Some of the captives tried to find ways to resist their circumstances, but Abdul Hamid had anticipated this. Escape was impossible. The chambers were located deep within the palace complex, accessible only through passages known to trusted eunuchs. Even if someone managed to get out of their room, they faced a maze of corridors guarded by men whose loyalty to the Sultan was absolute. The few who attempted escape were brought back as examples, their punishments witnessed by the entire collection as a reminder of the futility of resistance. Suicide, the ultimate form of escape, was also nearly impossible. The rooms contained nothing that could be used as a weapon against oneself, and the constant surveillance meant that any attempt at self-harm would be interrupted before it could succeed. The Sultan wanted his collection alive and beautiful, and he had taken every precaution to ensure they remained that way regardless of their own wishes. The psychological profiles of those who survived longest in Abdul Hamid's collection shared certain characteristics. They learned to dissociate from their circumstances, treating their captivity like an elaborate theatrical performance in which they played assigned roles. They developed the ability to compartmentalize their emotions, showing the Sultan what he wanted to see while protecting some inner core of themselves from complete destruction. These survivors often became the most tragic figures in the entire system because their adaptation to captivity came at the cost of their humanity. They learned to anticipate the Sultan's moods with uncanny accuracy, to present themselves in ways that maximize their chances of favorable treatment, and to view newer arrivals with the calculating eye of someone who understood that survival required the sacrifice of others. The hierarchy that developed within the male harem was complex and constantly shifting, based not just on the Sultan's current preferences, but on the captive's ability to navigate the treacherous social dynamics of their prison. Senior members wielded considerable influence over daily life, able to make existence bearable or unbearable for those below them in the pecking order. This power often corrupted them, turning victims into perpetrators as they used their limited authority to inflict on others the cruelties they had experienced themselves. The eunuch guards who supervised the male harem occupied a unique position in this twisted ecosystem. Most had been castrated as children and raised within the palace system, making them simultaneously insiders and outsiders to the world they policed. Their own experiences of violation and transformation created a complex relationship with the young men under their control. Sometimes sympathetic, sometimes cruelly indifferent, always ultimately loyal to the Sultan who controlled their fate as well. These guardians understood better than anyone the psychological mechanisms that kept the system functioning. They knew which captives were likely to attempt resistance and which had been broken beyond repair. They could identify the subtle signs of mental collapse that preceded suicide attempts and the equally subtle indicators of someone beginning to accept their circumstances. This knowledge made them invaluable to Abdul Hamid, but also complicit in perpetuating the horrors they supervised. The economic cost of maintaining the male harem was staggering, consuming resources that the Ottoman Empire could ill afford during a period of military and political crisis. The specialized architecture, the constant surveillance, the elaborate daily routines, the fine clothing and jewelry, the carefully planned meals, all of it required enormous expenditures that drained the imperial treasury. But Abdul Hamid seemed oblivious to these practical concerns, viewing the expenses justified by the pleasure his collection provided. The secrecy required to maintain the male harem also created security vulnerabilities that troubled more pragmatic palace officials. The hidden chambers and passages, the restricted access, the elaborate cover stories, all of it created opportunities for enemies to infiltrate the palace or gather intelligence about the Sultan's vulnerabilities. Foreign diplomats occasionally heard rumors about the Sultan's unusual interests, information that could be used to embarrass or blackmail the Ottoman court. But perhaps most dangerously, the time and energy Abdul Hamid devoted to his collection was time taken away from the urgent business of governing a declining empire. While he indulged his fantasies, Russian armies advanced through Ottoman territories, European powers carved up Ottoman influence in the Mediterranean, and domestic rebellions festered in provinces that received no imperial attention. The Sultan's sexual obsessions weren't just morally reprehensible, they were strategically catastrophic for the empire he was supposed to protect. The young men trapped in Abdul Hamid's chambers became unwilling witnesses to the decay of Ottoman power. They could see in their captors' behavior the same self-indulgent decadence that was destroying the empire itself. The Sultan, who claimed absolute authority over their bodies, couldn't even exercise basic self-control over his own desires. The man who demanded their complete submission was himself a slave to appetites that grew more demanding and destructive with each passing year. As months turned into years, the psychological toll on the captives became increasingly visible despite their efforts to maintain the appearances their captor demanded. The constant stress of performance, the isolation from normal human relationships, the complete lack of agency over their own lives, all of it created forms of trauma that manifested in ways both subtle and profound. Some developed nervous tics that they tried desperately to hide. Others experienced episodes of dissociation where they seemed to disappear inside themselves, present in body but absent in spirit. The most heartbreaking cases were those young men who began to identify with their captor, developing a form of psychological dependency that made them protective of the very system that destroyed them. They would compete desperately for Abdul Hamid's attention, genuinely devastated when they fell from favor, and genuinely grateful when they received even the smallest kindness. This psychological Stockholm syndrome represented the ultimate victory of the Sultan's methods, the complete transformation of victims into willing participants in their own degradation. But even as Abdul Hamid's system achieved its twisted objectives, cracks were beginning to appear in the foundation of his carefully constructed world. The strain of maintaining such an elaborate deception was taking its toll on everyone involved, from the lowest servants to the highest palace officials. Rumors were spreading beyond the palace walls, carried by dismissed servants and disgruntled courtiers who had grown disgusted with their sultan's excesses. More ominously, some of the young men in the collection were beginning to form genuine bonds, despite the system's attempts to prevent solidarity. These relationships, built on shared suffering and mutual support, represented a form of resistance that Abdul Hamid hadn't anticipated. As these connections strengthened, they would eventually provide the foundation for something the Sultan feared more than anything else: organized opposition to his absolute authority over the lives he had claimed as his property. The first crack in Abdul Hamid's carefully constructed world appeared in the most unexpected way, through the arrival of a young man who refused to break. His name was Dimitri, a 17-year-old Greek from Crete whose capture had been particularly brutal. Ottoman raiders had burned his village during a tax collection that turned violent, and Dimitri had watched his family die trying to protect him before being dragged away in chains. Unlike the other acquisitions who arrived broken by their journey and terrified by their circumstances, Dimitri retained something that Abdul Hamid had never encountered in his collection: an unshakable sense of his own worth. The usual process of psychological demolition seemed to slide off him like water off marble. When they burned his clothes, he stood naked with dignity. When they cut his hair in the Sultan's preferred style, he met his reflection with steady eyes. When they gave him a new name, Altan, meaning golden one, he acknowledged it with a slight nod but continued to whisper his real name in his prayers. Abdul Hamid was immediately fascinated by this resistance. Here was a challenge unlike any he had faced before, a beautiful young man who seemed immune to the techniques that had broken dozens of others. The Sultan began visiting Dimitri's chamber daily, engaging him in conversations that grew increasingly intense as Abdul Hamid tried to find the key to this boy's psychological fortress. What the Sultan didn't realize was that Dimitri's resistance came from a source he couldn't comprehend: genuine religious faith that provided an internal refuge no amount of external control could breach. While other captives had lost themselves in despair or dissociation, Dimitri maintained a connection to something beyond the palace walls, something that reminded him daily that his captivity was temporary, but his soul was eternal. This faith also gave Dimitri something that had been missing from the male harem since its creation: the ability to see his fellow captives not as competitors but as brothers in suffering. Where Abdul Hamid's system had intentionally fostered isolation and rivalry, Dimitri began building bridges of genuine human connection. He would catch the eye of a despairing boy during the Sultan's morning inspections, offering wordless comfort through a slight smile or reassuring nod. He shared his food with those who had fallen from favor and faced reduced rations. Most importantly, he began to whisper stories during the brief moments when surveillance was relaxed, tales of heroes who had endured captivity and emerged victorious. The impact of Dimitri's presence rippled through the collection like stones thrown into still water. Young men who had accepted their fate as inevitable began to remember who they had been before their capture. The carefully maintained hierarchy that had kept the captives divided started to crack, as bonds of genuine friendship replaced competitive desperation. For the first time since the male harem's creation, its inhabitants began to think of themselves not as individual prisoners but as a community of survivors. Abdul Hamid sensed these changes but initially misinterpreted their significance. He saw the increased solidarity among his captives as evidence that Dimitri was exerting some form of leadership, and this only made the Greek boy more intriguing to him. The Sultan began spending longer periods in Dimitri's chamber, conducting elaborate philosophical discussions about power, submission, and the nature of beauty. These conversations revealed more about Abdul Hamid's psychology than he intended, showing Dimitri the profound emptiness that drove the Sultan's obsessions. During one particularly revealing encounter, Abdul Hamid confessed that he had created the male harem because traditional relationships had always disappointed him. Women, he claimed, were too eager to please, too calculating in their affections, too obviously motivated by the desire for security or advancement. The young men in his collection, by contrast, could offer something purer: beauty without agenda, companionship without ulterior motives, devotion earned through kindness rather than demanded through power. Dimitri listened to these rationalizations with growing understanding of his captor's self-deception. The Sultan genuinely believed that he was creating something beautiful and meaningful, that his captives were grateful for the luxury and attention he provided, that their submission represented a form of love rather than learned helplessness. This delusion made Abdul Hamid more dangerous than a simple sadist would have been, because he felt justified in his actions and even virtuous in his treatment of his collection. But Dimitri also recognized an opportunity in the Sultan's need for validation. If Abdul Hamid wanted to believe that his captives loved him, then perhaps that need could be turned against him. The Greek boy began to modify his behavior subtly, showing just enough apparent warmth to encourage the Sultan's fantasies while maintaining his internal resistance. This delicate balancing act required enormous psychological strength, but it gave Dimitri something that no other captive had possessed: influence over their captor. The other young men in the collection watched this psychological chess match with fascination and growing hope. They saw that it was possible to resist Abdul Hamid's control without triggering the violent punishments that had crushed previous attempts at defiance. Dimitri was showing them a different path: not open rebellion, which was impossible, but subtle subversion that worked within the system to gradually undermine it. As winter turned to spring in 1791, the changes within the male harem became impossible to ignore. The captives moved differently, spoke differently, even looked different as their shared sense of dignity began to resurface. The eunuch guards reported increased whispered conversations and suspicious glances between the young men, but they couldn't identify any specific violations of the rules that governed the collection. The resistance was too subtle, too deeply embedded in human connections that couldn't be regulated through architecture or surveillance. Abdul Hamid's response to these changes revealed the paranoid streak that had always lurked beneath his cultivated sophistication. He began conducting random inspections at all hours, searching for evidence of conspiracies that existed more in his imagination than in reality. He installed additional mirrors and listening devices, turning the chambers into even more oppressive spaces of constant observation. Most disturbing of all, he began separating captives who seemed too close, moving them to different chambers or different schedules to prevent the formation of lasting bonds. But these measures only strengthened the resolve of the young men they were meant to intimidate. The increased surveillance made them more creative in their communication methods. The forced separations made their reunions more meaningful. The Sultan's obvious paranoia revealed his weakness rather than his strength, showing the captives that their captor was not the omnipotent figure he pretended to be, but a frightened man desperately trying to maintain control over forces he didn't understand. The breaking point came during the holy month of Ramadan, when even the palace observed some pretense of religious devotion. Abdul Hamid, perhaps feeling guilty about his obvious violations of Islamic law, decided to demonstrate his piety by allowing his collection to participate in evening prayers. This was meant to be a gesture of magnanimity, proof that he cared for his captives' spiritual welfare as well as their physical beauty. What the Sultan didn't anticipate was how powerful it would be for the young men to pray together, openly and in their own languages, for the first time since their capture. Christians, Muslims, and Jews found common ground in their shared humanity and their shared suffering. The prayers became a form of resistance, a declaration that there were authorities higher than the Sultan's will, and values more important than his pleasure. Dimitri used this opportunity to deliver what amounted to a sermon, speaking in carefully chosen words about faith, endurance, and the temporary nature of earthly power. His message was nominally religious, impossible for the guards to object to without seeming impious themselves, but every captive understood its deeper meaning. They were not just objects in a collection, they were human beings with inherent dignity that no amount of abuse could destroy. The psychological impact of this gathering reverberated through the male harem for days. Young men who had barely spoken for months began engaging in quiet conversations about their families, their homes, their hopes for eventual freedom. The competitive atmosphere that had poisoned relationships between captives gave way to genuine mutual support and shared planning for an uncertain future. Abdul Hamid could feel his control slipping away like sand through his fingers. The young men still performed their assigned roles, still maintained their physical beauty, still submitted to his demands, but something fundamental had changed in their relationship to their captivity. They were no longer broken spirits grateful for his attention. They were enduring souls counting the days until their liberation. The Sultan's attempts to reassert his authority became increasingly desperate and revealing. He began making grand pronouncements about his generosity, reminding his captives constantly of the luxury he provided and the protection he offered from the harsh world beyond the palace walls. He spoke of their special status as members of his intimate circle, chosen for their exceptional qualities and destined for greatness within the imperial household. But these speeches only highlighted the hollow nature of his relationship with his collection. The young men listened with the practiced attention they had learned to display, but their eyes held none of the gratitude or devotion the Sultan so desperately sought. They had learned to see through his rationalizations to the essential truth of their situation. They were prisoners, not privileged companions, and no amount of silk and gold could change that fundamental reality. The eunuch guards, caught between their loyalty to the Sultan and their growing sympathy for the captives they supervised, began to show subtle signs of their own internal conflict. Some became more lenient in their enforcement of petty rules. Others started providing small comforts, an extra blanket on cold nights, a moment of privacy for prayers, news from the outside world that technically violated security protocols but satisfied the captives' desperate hunger for connection to their former lives. These small acts of kindness created cracks in the system's foundation that spread far beyond their immediate impact. If the guards could show mercy, if even the Sultan's most trusted servants retained some capacity for human compassion, then perhaps the entire structure of the male harem was less solid than it appeared. The captives began to test other boundaries, pushing gently against restrictions to see which ones were truly enforced and which ones existed more in their own fear than in external reality. As 1791 drew to a close, the male harem had become something Abdul Hamid never intended, a community of resistance hidden within an institution of oppression. The young men had learned to survive not just as individuals clinging to their sanity, but as a group supporting each other through shared struggle and mutual hope. They had discovered that even in the darkest circumstances, human dignity could endure and human connections could flourish. But they had also learned something more dangerous. Their captor was not invincible. Abdul Hamid's increasing paranoia, his desperate need for validation, his obvious fear of losing control, all of these revealed a man whose power, however absolute it might appear, rested on foundations that could be shaken. The question now was whether they could find a way to shake those foundations without bringing the entire structure crashing down on their own heads. The answer would come from an unexpected direction, as events far beyond the palace walls began to create opportunities that even the most optimistic captive could never have imagined. The Ottoman Empire's military failures, diplomatic isolation, and internal rebellions were about to intersect with the personal crisis of its sultan in ways that would transform the fate of everyone trapped within the golden prison of the male harem. The revolution that would ultimately destroy Abdul Hamid's twisted paradise began not with the captives themselves, but with a single letter that arrived at the palace in the dead of winter, 1792. The message, written in the trembling hand of a provincial governor, brought news that would have terrified any rational ruler. Russian armies had crossed the Danube, Austrian forces were mobilizing in the Balkans, and local rebellions were erupting across the empire's Christian territories. But Abdul Hamid was no longer capable of a rational response to external threats. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of his secret chambers, and his ability to govern an empire had been consumed by his obsession with governing the bodies and souls of 24 young men. When his advisors demanded urgent meetings about military strategy, the Sultan postponed them to conduct his daily inspections. When treasury officials warned that the empire's finances were collapsing, he ordered new silk robes for his collection. While Ottoman soldiers died on distant battlefields, their sultan was consumed with the placement of mirrors in a teenager's cell. The disconnect between imperial crisis and imperial priorities became so extreme that palace officials began meeting in secret to discuss what they euphemistically called the succession question. These whispered conversations in hidden alcoves revealed a growing consensus among the Ottoman elite. Their sultan had become unfit to rule. The man who controlled the fate of millions had himself become enslaved to appetites that grew more demanding and destructive with each passing day. It was during one of these clandestine meetings that someone first suggested the unthinkable. If Abdul Hamid could not be reasoned with, if he could not be persuaded to abandon his obsessions for the sake of the empire, then perhaps he needed to be removed from power entirely. The word was never spoken aloud, but it hung in the air like incense. Revolution. The irony was profound. While the captives in the male harem dreamed of freedom through resistance, the empire's most powerful men were planning their own form of liberation from a sultan whose madness threatened everything they had sworn to protect. Two separate conspiracies were taking shape within the same palace walls, each unaware of the other's existence, each driven by the same fundamental recognition that Abdul Hamid's reign had become incompatible with human dignity. The first concrete step toward rebellion came from an unexpected source. The palace's chief eunuch, a man named Selim who had served 3 sultans and witnessed the gradual decay of imperial authority. Selim had watched Abdul Hamid's transformation from eccentric prince to obsessed tyrant, and he understood better than anyone how the sultan's personal corruption was poisoning the entire Ottoman system. More importantly, he had access to both the male harem and the highest levels of government, making him uniquely positioned to coordinate resistance from within. Selim's initial approach was characteristically subtle. He began allowing small infractions among the harem guards to go unpunished, testing their loyalty to the current regime. He permitted slightly longer prayer sessions for the captives, ostensibly for religious purposes, but actually to allow time for quiet conversations about their shared circumstances. Most significantly, he started sharing carefully selected information about the empire's deteriorating situation, letting both guards and captives understand that their sultan's obsessions were contributing to a national catastrophe. The response was immediate and profound. Guards who had rationalized their participation in the system by telling themselves they were serving the empire began to question whether that service had become a betrayal of everything they claimed to value. captives who had endured their suffering by believing it served some greater purpose discovered that their pain was actually contributing to their homeland's destruction. The moral foundation of the entire system began to crumble as its participants realized they were complicit in their own nation's downfall. Dimitri, whose influence among the captives had grown steadily throughout the winter, seized this moment to transform whispered resistance into organized action. During a prayer session that Selim deliberately extended, the Greek boy laid out a plan that was breathtaking in its audacity. The captives would not attempt escape. That remained impossible. Instead, they would stage a coordinated refusal to participate in their own degradation, accepting whatever consequences followed, rather than continuing to enable their captors' madness. The plan required every member of the collection to act simultaneously, knowing that individual resistance would result in savage punishment, while collective action might overwhelm the system's ability to respond. They would refuse to pose for the Sultan's inspections, decline to engage in the philosophical conversations he craved, and maintain absolute silence during his visits. Most importantly, they would demand to be treated as prisoners of war rather than willing participants in imperial pleasure, forcing Abdul Hamid to confront the reality of what he had created. The psychological preparation for this act of defiance consumed weeks of whispered planning and mutual encouragement. Young men who had been systematically isolated from human solidarity had to rediscover their capacity for collective action. Those who had learned to survive through submission had to find the courage for resistance. The process was itself a form of liberation, as the captives reclaimed their agency through the simple act of choosing their own fate rather than accepting the one imposed upon them. When the morning of reckoning finally arrived, the transformation was visible from the moment Abdul Hamid entered the first chamber for his daily inspection. Instead of the carefully posed figure he expected to find, he discovered a young man standing with military bearing, eyes fixed on a point above the Sultan's head, refusing to acknowledge the imperial presence. The scene was repeated in chamber after chamber, as Abdul Hamid's tour became a journey through his own powerlessness. The Sultan's initial response was fury so intense that palace servants fled the corridors to avoid his wrath. He raged about ingratitude, threatened punishments that would make previous discipline seem gentle, and demanded explanations that none of his captives would provide. But as his anger exhausted itself against walls of silent resistance, something else began to emerge. Fear. For the first time since creating his collection, Abdul Hamid was forced to confront the possibility that his control was an illusion built on his victims' despair rather than his own authority. The standoff that followed stretched through days that felt like years. The Sultan refused to abandon his daily inspections, but they became exercises in futility as he wandered through chambers filled with living statues who acknowledged his presence only through their determined refusal to participate in his fantasies. The captives, meanwhile, drew strength from their shared resistance, discovering that dignity was something that could not be taken from them, but only surrendered voluntarily. But the revolution within the male harem was about to intersect with the larger revolution brewing throughout the palace. As news of the captives' rebellion spread through the network of servants and guards, it became a symbol of something larger, the possibility of resistance to absolute power. If 24 enslaved young men could defy the Sultan's will, perhaps the empire's most powerful officials could find the courage to do the same. The crisis reached its climax when military dispatches arrived, reporting the complete collapse of Ottoman forces on the Russian front. Entire armies had been destroyed, provincial capitals had fallen, and enemy forces were advancing toward the empire's heartland. The Ottoman Empire faced potential extinction, and its sultan was conducting a war of wills with his own captives, while the real war raged beyond his comprehension. It was then that Selim made his final move, entering Abdul Hamid's private chambers during one of the sultan's increasingly frantic visits to the male harem. The chief eunuch's message was simple and devastating. The empire's generals were demanding the sultan's immediate attention to military matters. The treasury was empty, enemy armies were approaching Constantinople itself, and the Ottoman dynasty faced extinction unless Abdul Hamid abandoned his obsessions and returned to the business of governing. The Sultan's response revealed the complete triumph of madness over reason. He accused Selim of conspiracy, claimed that the military reports were fabricated to distract him from his important work with the collection, and insisted that the empire's problems would resolve themselves once he had successfully broken his captives' resistance. The disconnect from reality was so complete that Selim realized negotiation was impossible. Abdul Hamid had passed beyond the reach of reason, into a world where his fantasies were more real than the empire crumbling around him. That night, as cannon fire from approaching enemy forces echoed across the Bosphorus, the palace revolution finally began. It was not the dramatic uprising of popular imagination, but the quiet efficiency of experienced administrators who understood that their empire's survival required immediate action. Guards loyal to Selim secured key positions throughout the palace complex. Documents were prepared declaring Abdul Hamid mentally unfit to rule. Messages were dispatched to military commanders announcing the transition of power to his nephew, Selim III. The male harem was liberated in the pre-dawn darkness by guards who entered the chambers with keys rather than weapons. Their mission one of rescue rather than conquest. The young men who had endured years of captivity emerged blinking into corridors, filled with the sounds of a palace in transition. Running footsteps, urgent conversations, the opening of doors that had remained locked for far too long. Their resistance had not directly caused the revolution, but it had provided a moral catalyst that made action necessary and possible. Abdul Hamid himself was found in his private chambers, still dressed in the elaborate robes he wore for his daily inspections, surrounded by portraits of his collection and muttering about the ingratitude of those he had elevated to such exalted positions. He offered no resistance as guards escorted him to apartments that would serve as his prison for the remainder of his life. His last recorded words as Sultan were a request to visit his collection one final time, a request that was gently but firmly denied. The liberation of the captives revealed the full extent of the psychological and physical damage that Abdul Hamid's system had inflicted. Some of the young men were so traumatized by their experiences that they could barely function outside the controlled environment of their chambers. Others had developed such sophisticated survival mechanisms that they struggled to trust the reality of their freedom. All of them carried scars, visible and invisible, that would mark them for the rest of their lives. But liberation also revealed something remarkable: the human spirit's capacity for recovery, even after the most systematic attempts at destruction. Dimitri, whose resistance had sparked the final rebellion, emerged as a natural leader among the survivors, helping to organize their transition back to the world beyond the palace walls. His faith, which had sustained him through the darkest moments of captivity, now became a source of hope for others struggling to rebuild their shattered sense of self. The Ottoman Empire survived the crisis that had nearly destroyed it, though it would never again achieve the power and glory of its earlier centuries. The military disasters that had provided the immediate catalyst for revolution were eventually contained, but at enormous cost in territory, prestige, and human life. The empire's decline continued inexorably, hastened by years of neglect, while its sultan pursued his private obsessions at the expense of public duty. As for the survivors of the male harem, their fates varied widely. Some returned to their homelands to find families that had mourned them as dead, and communities that struggled to understand what they had endured. Others chose to remain in Constantinople, finding new lives in the Ottoman capital that had once been their prison. A few joined religious orders, seeking spiritual healing from trauma that secular medicine could not address, but all of them carried forward the memory of their resistance, the knowledge that even in the most desperate circumstances, human dignity could endure, and human solidarity could triumph over systematic oppression. Their story became part of the hidden history of Ottoman decline, a reminder that empires fall not just through military defeat or economic collapse, but through the moral corruption of those entrusted with power. The chambers that had housed Abdul Hamid's collection were sealed and forgotten, their hidden passages gradually discovered by later generations, who found it difficult to believe that such horrors had existed within the walls of imperial grandeur. But the lessons of their existence echo across centuries. That absolute power corrupts absolutely, that systematic dehumanization destroys both victim and perpetrator, and that the human capacity for both cruelty and resistance knows no bounds. In the end, the Mad Sultan's male harem stands as a testament to the darkest possibilities of unchecked authority and the brightest possibilities of human resilience. The young men who suffered within those walls achieved something their captor never could. They maintained their humanity in the face of systematic attempts to destroy it, and in doing so, they helped bring down the very system that had tried to break them. Their courage in the darkness reminds us that even in history's most brutal chapters, the light of human dignity can never be completely extinguished.